Warning: this podcast will be dealing with some violent subject matter which may not be suitable for a younger audience. It was in the early hours of the morning when Francis Crossan was walking home after a night out. The 34-year-old father of two was a Catholic from North Belfast and had no affiliation with any paramilitary organisations. He was a civilian. Little did he know that 4 men were following him in a black taxi. Suddenly, one of the men jumped out and hit him over the head with a wheel brace, stunning him. Francis was then dragged into the taxi, where he was brought to an alleyway in the nearby area of Shankill. There, he suffered a savage beating. A beer glass was shoved into his head, and his throat was slit so severely that it was cut almost through to the spine. His body was then dumped in an alley beside a nearby police station. Francis was the first innocent civilian to be butchered in such a grotesque and horrific way. And unfortunately, he would not be the last. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as two sides waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. The Shankill Butchers were a group of men who terrorised the streets of North Belfast from 1975 to 1982. In that time, there were around 12 people in the gang, and they all had one thing in common: a savage hatred of Catholics. They were branded the Butchers because of the cutthroat killings that they committed on some of their victims, but they also used bombs and bullets during their campaign. Lenny Murphy was the leader of the gang. He was born in Shankill, Belfast in 1952, and from an early age he was known as a violent person and had been known to brandish a knife in his primary school. He hated Catholics, describing them as scum and animals. At 16, he had a job as a shop assistant. It was at this age he also joined the paramilitary organisation, the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF. He was a heavy drinker and socialised often with a number of young women. Murphy was average in height and thin, with blue eyes and dark curly brown hair. His arms were covered in tattoos, many of which depicted loyalist images. Belfast journalist Mark Dillon wrote in his book, The Shankill Butchers, that it is incredible to think that Murphy was in fact a murderer by the age of 20. On the 28th of September 1972, a 32-year-old Protestant called William Pavis was murdered. Pavis was shot in the head in broad daylight. He was a Protestant, and the UVF suspected that he had been selling weapons to the Provisional IRA. 2 men were arrested after this shooting: Mervyn Connor and a 20-year-old Lenny Murphy. There was a very strong suspicion that Murphy was involved in the shooting. There were 2 witnesses who saw him pull the trigger, and he was also selected in an identification parade. In theory, it was an open-shut case. There was suspicion that Mervyn Connor would strike a plea deal, incriminating Murphy so that he could get his own freedom, or a lesser sentence. It wasn't long after this that Connor died after ingesting a large dose of cyanide in what was an apparent suicide. He also left a note confessing to the murder of Pavis, though it is believed that this note was written as a result of pressure from Murphy. The murder case for Pavis went to trial in June 1973, and Murphy was then acquitted. He was released and then re-arrested immediately as a result of his many escape attempts. He was then interned for 2 years before being released in 1975. While in prison, Murphy married the 19-year-old Margaret Gillespie, and the two had a daughter together. Upon his release, they then moved to an area in Belfast called the Upper Shankill. Murphy was now 25 years old, Murphy spent a lot of time in pubs in the area, especially the Brown Bear, the Lawnbrook Social Club, and the Biardo Bar. It was during this time he also set about assembling his very own paramilitary team. Paramilitary organisations at this time had a number of different rules. One of the big ones was trying to avoid civilian casualties, though both the IRA and the UVF failed at this on numerous occasions. Lenny Murphy didn't want to be tethered to the rules of the UVF. He wanted to have his own paramilitary organisation. He began by recruiting 3 individuals who also had a seething hatred of Catholics. They were 25-year-old Robert Basher Bates, who was a petty criminal, 20-year-old Sam McAllister, who also had a criminal history, and 25-year-old William Moore. Moore drove a black taxi and used to work as a meat packer, which is how the Butchers had access to a set of butcher knives and meat cleavers that would be used in their future attacks. Murphy enjoyed using the butcher knives and believed that the blade was the ultimate way to kill. There were other men who passed through the gang, but these were Murphy's trusted few. The first attack occurred on October 2nd, 1975, where they shot dead 2 men and 2 women during a robbery. The 4 victims had been working at a bottling plant. 1 month later, they began their campaign of cutthroat killings, which began with the murder of Francis Crossan, who was picked up at random and dragged into Moore's taxi. Crossan was then tortured and mutilated so badly that he had to have a closed casket at his funeral. The Butchers continued and then killed fellow UVF member Noel Shaw after an internal dispute. Just to clarify, Murphy was in the UVF, but he also wanted to start his own thing. That's why he started working with the Butchers as well. But it's unclear how much the UVF knew of Murphy's other activities. Then, less than a month later, Catholic Ted McQuaid and his wife were walking home from a party at night when a car pulled up beside them and a man jumped out and shot McQuaid 6 times at close range, killing him. Initially, McQuaid and Crossan's murders weren't connected, apart from the fact that they were 2 Catholics killed at random. Upon being interviewed by the police, McQuaid's wife provided some essential evidence and gave them their first lead. She recalled that the men had escaped in a black taxi. The hunt was on to find the killers. Police began by carrying out door-to-door inquiries in the Shankill, which was a primarily Protestant area of Belfast, and they were met with a wall of silence. People were absolutely terrified that if they told the police anything, they would become victims. There has been speculation that many people in the Shankill area knew who the Butchers were, but they were too terrified to tell the police. Baroness May Blood, who grew up in Belfast, explained the mentality of the people living in Shankill. Quote, "You don't know if your next door neighbour was involved in this. You don't know what might happen to your kids. You've got to live in the area to know and taste that fear. So people just decided, well, there's one other alternative. Go on in and close the door. These things aren't happening in our name, but we don't have to be a part of it." In this way, she's explaining that the local civilians who may have been Protestant, they didn't condone the violence that was happening against Catholics, but they were too terrified to speak out. Thomas Quinn was the next person to fall victim to the cutthroat attacks. On February the 6th, 1976, Thomas was drinking in a club. The 55-year-old road sweeper was on his way home when he was grabbed by the side of the road and forced into a car. His throat was then cut in the same manner that Francis Crossan's was. He had been nearly decapitated. His body was found the next morning, and the woman who found his body reported that the night before she heard the sound of a heavy-sounding engine, such as a black taxi. Police had heard enough accounts to conclude that these slayings were linked and began searching all the 700 black taxis in Belfast. honing in on the ones that operated in the area of Shankill. William Moore's taxi was among the taxis to be forensically tested for traces of blood. This is the taxi that the killings actually occurred in, yet police found nothing. Murphy then ordered the black taxi to be destroyed, and Moore bought a yellow Ford Cortina, which was then used in subsequent attacks. Just 3 days after killing Quinn, the Butchers struck again, killing Archibald Hanna and Raymond Carlyle. The two men were shot while sitting in a lorry. The Butchers believed that these men were Catholics on their way to work, but they were actually Protestants. Francis Rice was the next victim, who was abducted just 2 weeks after their last attack. He was abducted late at night at the weekend in the same area of Shankill. He had his throat slashed in the same manner as the other victims, and his body was then dumped. It was around this time that the media started to refer to the killers as the Butchers, due to the savage nature of their attacks. The random nature of these attacks, and the fact that they were carried out against civilians, caused terror in the streets of North Belfast. People were scared to go out late at night, and would run if they saw a black taxi approaching them. Charlotte Morrissey, whose father would eventually become one of their next victims, said, "We never went anywhere. After it got dark, you never ever went anywhere on your own. It really was the most fearful I've ever had in my life." A BBC Northern Ireland documentary about the Butchers mentions that loyalist leaders in the area knew that Murphy was running the gang. Journalist Jim Campbell explained that they were intimidated by Murphy, calling him a bloody psychopath. They didn't want to stop him from committing these attacks because they were afraid of retribution attacks. Campbell then claimed that the police would have known that Lenny Murphy was the leader of the gang, but had no proof against him. Some members of the Catholic community also believed this. Leading investigator, Detective Jimmy Nesbitt, completely disagrees. On the 11th of March 1976, there was a break in the case. Two Catholic women were walking along the Cliftonville Road in Belfast when they were shot at from a passing vehicle. The gunman then abandoned their vehicle and set it on fire before fleeing the scene. A witness saw one man acting suspiciously and placed a call to the police, who found a gun stashed near the scene. Instead of taking the gun, officers decided to place the street under surveillance. The following morning, a man returned to look for the gun. He was then arrested on the spot. Lenny Murphy had been caught. Murphy was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the possession of a firearm with intent to kill. It's also argued that by this stage, the police knew that Murphy was one of the Butchers, but had no proof to pin on him. They were just happy to have him behind bars. But to the horror of the people of Belfast, the killings continued. Though Lenny Murphy was incarcerated, he was determined that the killings of Catholics continue. He believed that if the killings went on, this would help exonerate him, and called in William Moore to continue the throat-slashing campaign. The killings resumed on the 2nd of August 1976, when the body of Cornelius Neeson was found on the side of the road. Neeson had been beaten to death, and a hatchet had also been used in the attack. 2 months later, 20-year-old student Stephen McCann went to a disco at the Queen's University Students' Union. Hours later, his body was found with his throat cut and a gunshot wound to the head. Thomas Easton was next. He was a loyalist and got into a fight with Sam McAllister in a pub. McAllister got thrown out, but decided to wait until Easton was leaving, and when he did, he was hit over the head with a brick, killing him. After that came James Moorhead. He was a member of the Ulster Defence Association, which is a rival organisation of the UVF, and was killed as a part of a personal dispute. The body count of the Shankill Butchers was now at 15, and there was no end in sight. They returned to the killing of Catholics on the 3rd of February 1977, with the murder of 52-year-old Joseph Morrissey. Like the other victims, Morrissey was out having a few drinks and was on his way home. He was snatched up and subjected to a horrific beating. He had been beaten with a hatchet and pieces of his body had been removed. His throat was cut so deeply that he had almost been decapitated. Joseph's daughter, Charlotte, said of the murder, "It's hard to believe that there would be such cruelty on such a very deep level. Hatred. Hatred because what? I'm Catholic? Because my father was a different religion? A good man, a hard-working man, who brought up his children to be good human beings. And to take him and torture him and beat him and cut him and remove parts of his body, it's beyond my comprehension. It really is." 1 month later, Francis Cassidy became the next victim of the Shankill Butchers. After that was 7-year-old Kevin McMenamin, who was killed in a bomb planted at a commemoration parade. The police investigation was making very slow progress, until the 10th of May 1977, when one of the Butchers' victims was found alive. Jared McLaverty was stopped by 2 of the Butchers who were posing as police officers. They ordered him into the car, where there were 2 others waiting for him. The men had spent the day drinking and brought McLaverty to an old, disused doctor's surgery, where he was beaten with sticks and stabbed multiple times. He then had his wrists slashed before he was dumped down an alleyway. Miraculously, he survived the night, and a passerby heard his cries for help the following morning. He was brought to the hospital where his life was saved. Detective Jimmy Nesbitt was alerted of the attack and soon realised that this had to be the work of the Butchers. 1 week later, as McLaverty was recovering from his injuries, Nesbitt disguised him and drove him around Shankill in the hopes that he'd be able to identify his attackers. They retraced the route McLaverty took on the night he was abducted, when suddenly McLaverty spotted one of the men, saying, "See that big fat fucker in the middle? That's one of them." He had identified Sam McAllister. They continued on, and McLaverty then spotted another one of the Butchers, Benjamin Pretty Boy Edwards. McLaverty then mentioned that while McAllister had been interrogating him, he had rolled up his sleeves to reveal gunshot wounds on his arms. If they could find the wounds on McAllister's body, then they had tangible proof that he was one of the attackers. Police arrested him the next morning and found the gunshot scars on his arms. They then searched the floorboards under his house, where they found a 6-inch steak knife and 2 10-inch boning knives. McLaverty also described another one of the attackers, and this description fit the bill of William Moore. He also went on to say that he had been taken away in a yellow Ford Cortina, which Moore owned. Detectives searched Moore's car and found traces of McLaverty's clothing in the car. Moore was interrogated, eventually confessed to the killing of McLaverty, but there was no proof tying him to any of the other murders. They needed to get one of them to talk. When questioned about the cutthroat killings, Moore said that he had nothing to do with them. He soon changed his tune and admitted that he had played a part in all of the cutthroat killings, saying, "Murphy done the first 3 and I done the rest." He then explained that Murphy had been giving him instructions from prison. All in all, Murphy's 3 henchmen, along with 8 others, all confessed to their involvement in the 19 murders. However, author Mark Dillon suggests that this number could be higher. With 19 people killed, this number made them the most prolific serial killers in British history. In February 1979, the men were handed down their sentences. Between them all, they were sentenced to nearly 2,000 years behind bars. Despite justice being served, there was one name missing from this list: Lenny Murphy. The master butcher had escaped conviction. 3 years after the trial of the Shankill Butchers, Murphy was released from prison. He began his reign of terror straight away, beating to death a Protestant man with special needs just 1 day after being released from prison. There were more murders against rival Loyalist gang members in which he was a suspect, and it was also suspected that Murphy had begun recruiting again and trying to build up a new gang of Shankill Butchers. In October 1982, the IRA kidnapped a British sergeant from the Ulster Defence Regiment. In response to this, Murphy hijacked a black taxi and drove it to a Catholic area, where it was flagged down by Catholic Joseph Duggan. Duggan got into the taxi and was immediately attacked by Murphy. He was then driven to Murphy's old house and he was tortured. It is also reported that Murphy pulled out all but 3 of his teeth with pliers before he was battered to death with a shovel. Duggan's body was then dumped behind Murphy's house, where it was found the next day, and Murphy and 2 others were arrested. They were released shortly afterwards because there was no evidence that Murphy took part in the crime. By this stage, Murphy was becoming a liability. He was unstable, and he was willing to kill anyone, Protestant or Catholic. He was out of control. The horrific nature of his killings in the name of loyalism was giving a bad name to all loyalists, and other paramilitary organisations were not happy. On the 16th of November 1982, Murphy drove over to his girlfriend's house. As he was getting out of his car, 2 provisional IRA gunmen jumped out of the back of a nearby van. With an assault rifle and a 6mm pistol, they shot Lenny Murphy over 20 times. He was killed instantly in the attack. The attack occurred in Glencar, in the same estate where many of the Butchers' victims were dumped. It is speculated that the IRA were tipped off about Murphy's location by members of the UVF, who believed that he'd become a liability. Another theory is that the tip-off was provided by an enemy of Murphy, who wanted him out of the picture. The IRA soon released a statement saying, "Lenny Murphy, and then Master Butcher in brackets, has been responsible for the horrific murders of over 20 innocent nationalists in the Belfast area, and a number of Protestants. The IRA has been aware for some time that since his release recently from prison, Murphy was attempting to re-establish a similar murder gang to which he led in the mid-1970s. And in fact, he was responsible for a number of the recent sectarian murders in the Belfast area. The IRA takes this opportunity to restate its policy of non-sectarian attacks, while retaining its right to take unequivocal action against those who direct or motivate sectarian slaughter against the nationalist population." Murphy was buried with the epitaph on his gravestone which said, "Here lies a soldier." His mother Joyce continued to deny that he was a violent individual, saying, "My Lenny could not have hurt a fly." He was given a paramilitary funeral, of which thousands of loyalists attended and some politicians as well. The remaining members of the Shankill Butchers were all released between 1996 and 1998 as part of the peacemaking process in Northern Ireland. As of 2020, there is only one senior member of the Butchers still alive. His identity has never been released, but he is referred to as Mr. A. William Moore was released in 1998 after 21 years behind bars. He died of a suspected heart attack in 2009. In 1997, Butcher Robert Bates was murdered by the son of an Ulster Defence Association member. Bates was given a soldier's funeral, and Charlotte Morrissey, whose father was killed by the Butchers, ended up stuck in traffic because of Bates's funeral procession. Speaking about his death, she said, "For me, it was like they were honouring some sort of hero. You know, is that what people really thought about the Shankill Butchers? Were they heroes? I found myself trapped in the car, unable to get out or speak. I can't tell you how I felt, but for me, the message was, You know, he was a hero. The man who cut my father to pieces and tortured him for 3 hours was a hero.